great to, sorry, let me click continue. Thanks, Yana. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation and welcome to everybody. So I'm going to talk about the new urban science, digitalizing cities through interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaboration. And I'll try to talk for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes, and then open it up. But I'd love to start a discussion, questions, comments, feedback would be wonderful. So let's get going here. Cities of the 21st century are at a crossroads. On the one hand, we're facing multiple crises. We have COVID and various pandemics that are occurring. We have the climate crisis that we all know about. There are rising social inequalities. There's economic precarity, multiple other issues that we're having to deal with, not just in the world, but specifically in cities. But at the same time, a lot of people are looking to cities for improved urban futures. So they see cities as an opportunity, as a place where we can diagnose the current social ills that we're experiencing and figure out ways to create lifestyles that are sustainable, that are resilient, that are livable. So we're really seeing this idea that we can use digitalization as a vehicle to achieve the sustainable society. So we've started to talk about this idea of the sustainable smart city, or the smart sustainable city. I'm not sure which one should come first. And an important part of this sustainable smart city is this idea of the new urban science. And so here's a fairly explicit definition from Anthony Townsend from about 5 years ago. He says, the new urban science is an emerging domain of research at the intersection of science and design, drawing on new disciplines in the natural and information sciences that seek to exploit the growing abundance of computation and data. So that's fairly straightforward. This is a relatively new discourse, this idea of the new urban science. Most of the papers that I can find on it, are from maybe the last 5 years or so. And the idea with the new urban science is that we have digital tools now that can help us to know cities more intimately. And then we can apply the knowledge that we get from those digital tools to enhance urban development processes. Right, so it's this idea that we can connect up our scientific practices and directly use those to improve society. So it's a very logical idea. It's a very compelling idea, and for all of us here, who I think are all researchers, we're very excited about it. Right? Yeah, research is going to save the world. Why not? That sounds great. But what I want to do today is raise a couple of questions about the new urban science. So things like who's involved in the new urban science? What types of knowledge generation are they involved in? What types of assumptions are they making about cities and society? Should we be promoting this? Should we be fighting this and trashing this? Could the new urban science be improved? And if so, what would we do to improve it? So this presentation is really based on, it started with a roundtable that I co-hosted with Vladimir Cvetkovic last year. We were on the campus back pre-COVID. It was another lifetime, but we had a nice discussion with a panel of experts about what this new urban science means and what it might mean. So that was about a year ago, and that was connected to the Humanizing the Sustainable Smart City project, or HIS. And that's one of 9 digital futures projects that's currently being funded. And a lot of this draws upon the discussions that I've had with my HIS colleagues. Several of them are here today, and hopefully they can jump in during the discussion. And we've experienced kind of some of the things that we're talking about here today. So I think it'll be fun to talk to you about it. And we're developing a position paper at the moment that this talk is based upon. So I should say at the start that all the good ideas are my HIS colleagues. All the bad ideas are mine, so I'll take credit for the bad ideas. But we would, of course, welcome feedback. We're hoping to submit this paper in the next few weeks, so it'd be good just to hear what you think about it. So I'm going to talk about 2 things over the next 30 minutes or so. One is that I want to talk about the rise of the new urban science. What is it? Where did it come from? What does it mean? And then, are there ways that we can enhance urban scientific practices through this idea of the new urban science? So let's start with the rise of the new urban science. Cities have always been closely intertwined with scientific practices, with scientific inquiry, but also with technological development. This is one of my favorite maps from the early 1900s. This is Baltimore, and it shows the subsurface of Baltimore at the time. You can see water, you can see sewer, you can see all kinds of different random conduits that are underneath the street. This is over 100 years ago. But of course, it goes back further than this. We can go back to the Middle East, we can go back to South America, we can go to Asia from kind of the earliest days of human settlements. Fast forward to the present day, and we can see that science and technology are central to urban development processes. And in the global north, one of my favorite time periods is kind of the late 19th, early 20th.
Sorry for interrupting, but we don't see your slides.
Oh. How's that?
No, but you are presenting them so vividly, so we can see them internally.
We just see the first slide.
Sorry. Let me stop and start again. That's weird. I know you guys are here just to see the slides. You're not here to see me. Can you see that now?
Yeah, that's fine.
Is that Baltimore 1908? Yeah? Okay, thanks for stopping me. What was the previous slide? Okay, that's not interesting. Thank you. So cities and technology and scientific practice have always been mixed up. And as I was saying, I'm very interested in this kind of period between the late 1800s and early 1900s, when there was a lot of work on public health. There was a lot of work on building up these large technical infrastructure systems. And the scientific method was central to these processes of designing, building, and maintaining systems. And so we can see there were a number of engineers who were very interested in this idea of the science of cities. So this is an engineer named George Ford from the United States. And he had an article called The City Scientific in Engineering Record. And he said, city planning is rapidly becoming as definite a science as pure engineering. So you can see this real connection between urban planning and urban development, but also the scientific method and technological development. And it really reflects a broad move by engineers, by natural scientists, by policymakers to rationalize cities. And so they often use metaphors of machines. And the idea was that the city was a machine, and you could use models and you could use formulas, and then you could optimize the multiple functions that make cities work. And so when we say, if we say that's the urban science, then we say, well, what's new about the new urban science? And I think you probably can already guess what that is. Digitalization. And really it's about this marriage of computer science and information science, and all these different ideas about quantitative modeling and machine learning and pattern recognition and urban analytics that we've seen emerge maybe over the past 20 years or so. But it's something that really goes back to kind of the 1940s, when we first started to have computing power that could work with these types of analyses. But the idea, even from the 1940s to the present, was how to understand, how to explain, and how to predict city processes. And so today we see this lineage in a number of world-leading institutes. You're probably familiar with the University College London has CASA, or the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, with Mike Batty. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology has the Sensible City Lab. So Carlo Ratti has been very much involved in the digital futures work that we're doing at KTH. And then a number of other big centers around the world. And I should probably include KTH on here. I'm probably going to get in trouble for not mentioning them. But of course, we're doing a lot of work on this type of new urban science as well. So this is great, right? This is exciting. This is fantastic. Let's go. Let's start using computing power to help us understand and help us shape cities in better ways. What could be wrong with this scenario? Well, in the 20th century, so not too long ago, there was the discourse of urban science had a number of different proponents that were advocating for this perspective on cities, but then it also had a lot of detractors. So there were urban planning professionals, but there were also civil society groups that said, yes, urban science is not exactly the way that cities work. It's really this rational approach to urban development, and it really is overly optimistic about understanding and controlling and managing cities. And so the critics really highlighted that these models and predictions were not necessarily realistic, they were not necessarily desirable, and they could have unintended consequences. And this was really prominent as part of the larger discourse on urban planning in the 1960s and 1970s. And there was a critique of the rational, top-down, technocratic approach to urban development. And there was a push towards collaborative planning, participatory planning, and opening up urban development knowledge to a wider range of stakeholders. So in other words, the argument was we can't leave urban development just to the engineers and to the scientists. We have to include other stakeholders in this. And so a current example of this, which many of you probably know about, was the collapse of the Sidewalk Labs Smart City project in Toronto, and this happened in May. So Sidewalk Labs is a subsidiary of Google, and they proposed this wonderful new urban development on the waterfront in Toronto, and they were going to build the city from the internet up. And the only problem with that was that the citizens and the politicians and policymakers there said, that's not our vision for Toronto. So they worked on this for a few years, and they had all kinds of different technological innovations and scientific method for measuring how well the technologies performed. Ultimately, in May, they said, well, due to COVID, we're going to cancel this project. And I'm sure COVID was to blame, but there were also a number of different project failures due to sustained and vigorous protest by civil society groups and even by the local government there that was supposed to be partnering with Sidewalk Labs. So I think what this shows is not that, well, maybe it shows one thing, that Google isn't very good at urban development processes, which is not surprising. But I think it's also a good current example of how science and technology and urban development is a deeply political and contested practice. So if we dig into that just a little bit more, we can find out these critiques really come down to many of the ontological and epistemological assumptions that are made, that are lurking behind the new urban science. So there are critiques that the new urban science is objective, that it's self-evident, that it's linear, it's positivist, it's rational, it's mechanistic, it's universal, and so on. And what this critique is trying to say is that urban science is one way of looking at cities. But there are other ontologies, there are other epistemologies that can be used to look at cities. Of particular note comes from social scientists. So sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists, geographers, urban planners, they also study cities. They also collect empirical data. They use the scientific method and they develop novel insights. But they almost never use the term urban science. And when I talk to my colleagues who are social scientists and I say, you know, I'm interested in urban science, and they go, ugh, not that. Why are you involved in that? And I say, well, I think it's interesting, and I think there's some things to explore here. And they go, oh, yeah, don't do that. So I've experienced it firsthand. But what's interesting to me is they don't use that label urban science, but they are conducting science on cities. So we might argue that social scientists are also practicing urban science, but in a very different way. And so if you're a social scientist, if you're in planning, if you're in architecture, if you're in landscape architecture, one of the things that we go back to when we talk about urban science practices is the Chicago School of Sociology. So this was a famous example from the 1910s and 1920s, where sociologists went out into the city of Chicago and used it as an urban laboratory. And they were interested in studying economic, cultural, political, social histories and current processes. And they came up with this famous diagram of concentric circles of urban development, and they were trying to show how cities expand and contract. This has now become part of the canon of urban planning history. So if you take a course on urban planning, you'll undoubtedly see this diagram or something very similar to it. And today there's a very vibrant research agenda in the social sciences that focuses on the social, the political, and cultural impacts, both positive and negative, of smart cities, of digitalization. So we can see a connection between the Chicago School of Sociology and contemporary analyses of smart cities. So this points towards sort of a battle, right? Do we want to take a natural science and engineering approach to practicing science in the city, or do we want to take a social sciences approach, right? It's got to be one or the other. Who's right? Who's wrong? Are these really both urban sciences? Is one the real science? Is there a hard science and is there a soft science? Do we need to choose between the two? And for those of you that have followed various scientific debates, you might remember back in the 1980s, there was something called the science wars that pitted the natural sciences and the engineering against the social sciences. And there were huge debates that were about quantitative research versus qualitative research, positivists versus social constructionists, the hard sciences versus soft sciences, and so on. So we could say, okay, Andy, so we're just rehearsing these debates that we've been having for 30, 40 years. Another opportunity would be, what if we change that versus, what if we change that to a plus? What if we said, rather than having them fight over epistemology and ontology, what if we found a way for these different scientific practices to work together? So that's the position that we're taking in this paper, is that we think that because of the contemporary challenges that are faced by current cities, that we need both the natural sciences and the social sciences. Both of them are necessary but insufficient for us to really create sustainable, resilient, and livable cities. So it's not an either or question, it's a both and question. So you say, okay, great, Andy, let's say it is a both and question. How do we actually go and do that? How do we realize this sort of big tent approach? How do we expand the new urban science to be more inclusive, to include more than just natural sciences and engineering? So one thing that we need to do is we need to think about interdisciplinarity. So here's a long quote from Michel Acuto and colleagues. So he says that today's urban research, far from being a coherent urban science, remains trapped in the 20th century tradition of the systematic study of individual cities and the rise of specialized academic disciplines and professions associated with, amongst others, economics, health, planning, engineering, and design. And so what they're doing is they're criticizing everybody that works on cities. And they're saying you have too many disciplinary silos, you're not working together. And what we need to do is, of course, we need to embrace interdisciplinarity. We need to work together to study cities from multiple different perspectives. And this is an exciting, but it's also a very daunting task. And interdisciplinary is not something that emerged out of the new urban science, it's not something that emerged out of digitalization. For those of us that study sustainability, we've been talking about interdisciplinary study forever, and we've made some progress in doing interdisciplinary science, but I think all of us would agree that it's very difficult to do, and it takes a lot of work. But one way that we've started to realize we can do interdisciplinary science better when we're working on cities is to start thinking about our ontologies and our epistemologies in a different way. And the thing that we're drawing on in this paper is that interdisciplinary research over the last maybe 3 or 4 decades has really adopted ideas from complexity science and in ecological sciences. So we start to talk about these terms like contingency and uncertainty and emergence and synergistic processes. It sees city processes as messy. It's complex, dynamic, in particular. So it's this recognition that urban processes are nonlinear, that they're dynamic, and that they emerge over time. So in this sense, this metaphor that we've used, that the city is a machine that we can somehow optimize, doesn't work so well. But instead, we need to replace that with the metaphor of the city as a biological or ecological organism. And then this suggests that urban science is much better at, it's not so good at predicting futures, and future development patterns, but it's actually better at understanding contemporary complex dynamics. So it's still a science. But it's significantly different from both the natural and engineering sciences on one hand and the social sciences on the other hand. And so this idea of complexity, this idea of ecological sciences is supposed to be this sort of meeting place where these different scientific practices can come together. So how can we develop these ideas about complexity, about uncertainty, about emergence? So it means that we need quantitative approaches that look at material flows, that look at processes, that look at connections, but we also need qualitative approaches that focus on politics and ideologies and governance and social relations and things. So it requires this embrace of pluralism, right? And it's this recognition that there are multiple ways to understand the city. So it's this move away from one singular new urban science to multiple urban sciences that we can really focus on. And it also says that we need to develop a series of partial perspectives. So it acknowledges that these different perspectives are complementary, they're useful to scientific discovery. And I realize this is a big request to make. We live in a kind of a post-political, post-fact world today, and this is, we're becoming more and more polarized, and this says no, we actually need to come together. But at the same time, we need to adhere to the fundamental scientific tenets. So we still need to have validity. We still need to have reliability and replicability. We still need to have verification, falsification. So it's not the abandonment of the scientific method, but it says that we need to update the way that we do science based on the current conditions of the cities. So a tangible example of this, many of you are probably familiar with it, so I won't talk about it for a long time, but is the Live-In Lab that's on the KTH campus. So this is a place where experiments are conducted in situ by a range of different scientists, but from both the social sciences and the natural sciences and engineering. So it's this nice kind of bridge between the different scientific practices in the real world. And so you can see these multiple different disciplines and multiple different questions that are being explored through different experiments that are happening in the Live-In Lab. And one of the nice things about this is with the Live-In Lab and with this idea of interdisciplinary research is that we don't necessarily need to abandon our disciplinary work, right? We can still work as sociologists. We can still work as systems control analysts. We can still work as building scientists, but we can also come together and do interdisciplinary work that crosses some different boundaries. So it's an approach where we can do our own thing, but we can also work with others to do other things. I think that the downside of doing interdisciplinary research, and I'd love to hear some feedback from other people about what they think the advantages and disadvantages are. But one of the downsides is it requires a lot of discussion to find common ground. So even within the HIS team, having discussions about what is science, what is research, what is evidence, what kind of methods are the right ones to use. We get in these long debates just to figure out what each other is talking about. What do we mean when we talk about the city? What do we mean when we talk about a district? They're very frustrating conversations at times, but they can also be very fruitful conversations. I should also say that interdisciplinarity doesn't mean that we all need to agree on everything all the time, right? It doesn't mean that we need to embrace a singular worldview. It actually, we need to reserve the right to disagree, right? So these frictions, these disagreements are part and parcel of knowledge generation, and they should serve as the fuel for the new urban science. So we're not looking for certainty. We're not looking for a single best optimal perspective on how to conduct scientific research in cities. Instead, we're taking a plural approach to it. And so we're starting to see these scientific debates, these plural scientific debates emerge in smart cities. Initially, it was kind of about technology proponents saying how wonderful the smart city was going to be. And then it was social scientists saying this is how horrible those things are going to be when they actually come out. But we've seen maybe in the last 4 or 5 years that there's been some common ground where these different scientific approaches have come together, and there's some really inspiring projects out there. So I think what this does for me is this really says that if we do interdisciplinary urban research, we recognize that the city is a socio-technical achievement, or it's a number of socio-technical processes, and it needs to be informed by multiple perspectives. So you've probably heard that argument about interdisciplinarity before. So interdisciplinarity is a huge endeavor. Getting social scientists, natural scientists, engineers around the table, get them to collaborate, get them to agree, get them to disagree is a lot of work. And is this sufficient? No, it's not sufficient. New urban science needs to go beyond science, and it needs to go beyond the regular cast of characters who engage in science practices. So this is where transdisciplinary work comes in. So here's a nice summary of transdisciplinary research: collaborative knowledge development that supports a whole of system view and transformational change at multiple scales. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means about going beyond the typical sciences to engage with the humanities, with the arts, with different disciplines, but it also means going beyond the academy, which is even more difficult, to engage with the public sector, with the private sector, with civil society. So in the smart cities world, we call this the quadruple helix, and that comes from business studies. But the idea is that you have public, private, academic, and civil society actors who come together to co-create, to co-design, to co-produce smart cities. And so this calls, number one, this calls for reimagining that interface between scientific knowledge production and policy production, but it also reinvents that interface between science and society. So we need to question how scientific knowledge is designed, who's involved, who helps to generate it and apply it. And it requires these engaged participatory approaches that are aimed towards addressing the needs of society. And this might seem self-evident, but it's really hard to find these examples in practice. So again, if we look to Stockholm, if we go a little bit beyond the KTH campus, we can see that Stockholm is number one involved in a lot of transdisciplinary urban science by participating in global networks of knowledge sharing about sustainable and resilient urban development. We've seen these explode over the last 2 decades. So this map shows that there's over 200 city networks today. So things like the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities Program, the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and so forth. C40, you've heard about these things, ICLEI. And these are different groups that organize a different range of scientists, policymakers, civil society organizations, private companies, and so on. And arguably, they do really interesting and helpful work on understanding, on implementing sustainable, resilient, and livable cities. So that's kind of at the global scale, and we're probably a bit familiar with these global networks, but we can actually drill down to the local scale. So if we come down here to Stockholm, there's a lot of different place-specific modes of transdisciplinary science that are happening. We've got Hammarby Hostad, which everybody knows about, but that's now kind of transforming into phase 2 of that urban development. Barkarbystaden is doing a lot of interesting things on urban mobility solutions. We have the Sensible Stockholm Lab that's here on the KTH campus. We have the Urban ICT Arena in Kista and so on. All of these are really interesting examples that are about place-specific innovation. So urban laboratories, innovation districts, test beds, citizen science. These are different types of applied scientific practice. Are they amazingly great transdisciplinary projects? Probably not. Most of them probably aren't working too much with civil society. They tend to be academics like ourselves, researchers working with private companies, with public authorities. Sometimes there's some civil society participation there. But what this does is this really recognizes the importance of the local, of the context, and the ways that we can do digitalization in situ, where we can trial different things. I think with both these global networks and with these place-based initiatives, these innovation projects, we can start to connect up digitalization and the new urban science with the people that are most affected by the changes. So I draw on John Dewey, who's a famous American philosopher, and he says, the man who wears the shoe knows best that it pinches and where it pinches, even if the expert shoemaker is the best judge of how the trouble is to be remedied. So I guess in this quote, that means that us as researchers, us as scientists, we're the shoemakers. And then there are public policy makers, there are private industry representatives, there are civil society organizations, and generally citizens who are the man or the person who wears the shoe. So the idea is to start engaging them in more democratic modes of urban development and kind of opening up these ideas of scientific knowledge production to other people. So again, just like interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity is a very difficult task to do. Really deep participation, engage all urban stakeholders is nearly impossible to do. There are a few examples around the world. I think the places that I point to that I see as being inspiring are in Amsterdam, maybe, and Barcelona seem to be places where they're trying out these different models. But there's a lot of talk about being inclusive, about being participatory, about co-design, co-production. Whether that's really happening in practice or not, I don't know. But my sense is that transdisciplinarity is probably a bigger challenge for us than interdisciplinarity. But both of them are really helpful for us if we want to expand the new urban science beyond its current practices. So to conclude, let me end with a formula that we can all understand. So the idea here is that we need a new kind of urban science, a new kind of new urban science. Maybe I should pluralize that, new urban sciences, I don't know. But the idea is that it needs to be informed by interdisciplinary practice, but also transdisciplinary practice. And so the push here is for developing a community of learning that's both within the academy, that's on campus, but also spilling off campus to engage with those who don't usually participate in scientific practices. I think there's a lot of worry today about the smart city and about digitalization and about the idea that this could actually return to kind of a technocratic approach to urban development that was dominant in the 1910s, 1920s, particularly in North America and Europe. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. And I think us as researchers, we have an opportunity to steer the new urban science, to open it up to this more socio-technical approach to urban development that's more inclusive, that's more democratic. But of course, this requires interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work to do that. And so it's through this sort of plural approach to knowing and acting upon cities that we can devise and deliver improved urban futures that are beneficial for all. Thanks.